a couple of minutes after the half-past point. I'll let people kind of continue rolling in, but for the sake of keeping the meeting precise and on point, and until we can again get to meet face-to-face, and the good news, I think, is things are pointing in the positive direction. I am going to continue being optimistic and think that shortly, within a reasonable amount of time, maybe early next year, we'll actually start thinking about conducting face-to-face meetings. Of course, November was supposed to be our first month where we were actually going to do a face-to-face meeting, and here we are again in this quasi-virtual nightmare that I call, I don't know, Zoom meeting, I guess. So that said, thank you for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have folks attend these sessions. Our chapter is here for the general public. Obviously, we are a Seattle chapter, but that doesn't restrict access. We invite everybody, anybody that's interested in the ISC2, that's our general interest, to really drive that awareness and the education associated with that. That said, I wanted to quickly introduce the board of directors. We have now grown to a total of 8. And we're always looking for people that have eager interest in helping the organization. There's lots of work. Interestingly enough, right now, I don't think it's too crazy amount of work, but you know, it's an opportunity to build an organization. So that we've been at it now for almost a year, officially almost a year. So we're coming up to our first year anniversary, in fact, in quarantine health. So what can I say? Board, thank you, all of you guys. And I will, before I move to the next slide, I do want to ask, does any board member have any announcement or anything that they'd like to share with our audience before I move on? Going once, going twice.
Oh, I gotta say something. How can I, you see? Yeah. No, I'm glad you said what you did about the being open to the public, because I've been inviting people who, some of whom don't even live in the Seattle area, but so welcome.
Absolutely true. Including, we have a guest from Alaska. Fantastic to see that. And you know, again, at the end of the day, our organization's here to serve the community, especially in the InfoSec, and specifically, what we are trying to do is assist individuals and organizations as a whole to be successful in their journey to accreditation. With that, we are a small organization. We really are not an expensive organization, but we do require sponsorship to be able to survive. We don't charge our members right now, which is something also very important. So with that in mind, I want to put a hearty thank you to Caliber Security Partners, who has been our featured sponsor for this year. They took that exclusive space. And then since then, we have actually garnered 3 additional sponsors, BlackBerry Silence, IOActive, and Cybereason. Thank you to all 4 of you to support this chapter. To anybody that joined, if your organization feels like there is value in participating, right now sponsorship is relatively inexpensive. We're looking at $500, and of course, you know, I always have to, as a president, say, what's the benefit? Well, right now the benefit is you get visibility and you get me mentioning you. In the future, we will definitely extend more capabilities and opportunities. We've had IOActive take an opportunity to present to us, and I do look forward to our other sponsors to take a session in the near future and give us their perspective on cyber. A couple of other things that I'd like to make sure everybody's aware, and I just noticed that the Secure World link is cut off a little bit, including the promotion code. Wait, that's not good. Yeah, the image got like chopped up. Fantastic. All right, so I will.
Are you sharing? Excuse me. Are you sharing the slides? Because we don't see anything.
You don't see anything? That's
Do other people see?
I'm seeing a slide.
Yes, I can see.
Okay, then it must be me. Thank you.
Yeah, join in on, or connect and unconnect, maybe, who knows. So the Secure World is both Secure World and Interface this year are partners and conference partners. You can see the code for Interface. That'll be occurring December 9th, and I believe 9th and 10th. And the registration code, please use it. One of the benefits is if you use our code is that we will be collecting your member information after Interface is over and submitting those CPEs on your behalf. Likewise, Secure World, both the D is missing on the Secure World, and also the left side of this image with the code is missing. So what I'll do is after Lori starts presenting, I'll put the invitation code into the discussion, or anybody can actually pull this stuff up just by going to our website. That information is available there. That said, I want to introduce a friend of mine who I've worked with directly and recently just left the organization. So I'm in a different business, but Lori and I worked in the same unit within Microsoft. And one of the things that I did is I reached out to her a while ago and I asked her to join my board. And one of the benefits, or one of the burdens, I don't know yet, Lori, you can tell me either way, is all our board members are asked to present, to provide their perspective. Obviously, we are leaders in the industry and we should be able to share our perspectives on what's going on. So that said, Lori will be covering risk management framework. This is a great opportunity to learn about her perspective on this. I don't know if, Lori, do you apply anything from your current environment on top of this conversation? Because I mean, talk about risk management and what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's a heck of an alignment, but I know there may be some restrictions there. With that, Lori, I'll hand it off to you. You are a co-presenter. You should be able to go ahead and push your presentation up.
Let me.
While she does that, as everybody make aware, if you gave us your ISC2 number during your sign-in, that information will be used to register your time with us. So we will probably go just about an hour, and that means that you'll get one CPE. All right, Lori, I think that's all I have to say.
So PowerPoint is being difficult with me sharing my screen. So instead of being in presentation mode, I'm just going to share like this. Can everybody see my screen?
Looks beautiful.
Yep, looks good.
All right. So security risk management framework. I'm going to actually approach this from more of a higher level. So we're going to actually talk a little bit about security risk, is risk management. So there are no absolutes in managing security risk. So, and I've got the picture of the bricks here because I have worked with a security architect in a previous life where he was challenged to bring a fully secure system to a meeting. And that's what he brought, was a brick, because there's no way to interact with it. So no way to compromise, and there's no information leaking. So that's the little story behind the brick there. And really it boils down to architect a fully secure system. You have to go on the assumption of infinite resources, infinite budget. So, and sadly, that's not the case when it comes to everyday life. So mature security management is really risk-based. So what this means is decisions are made based on the communications within the organization and leadership that quantify the impact, cost, and mitigations associated with security controls to manage that risk for security. And what security controls are mitigated or are implemented are based on the risk for each individual situation. So what risk management framework provides is a flexible vehicle to evaluate those security risks and actually presents a holistic approach to managing that risk in order to identify appropriate countermeasures. So are there any questions on that? Okay. And what you'll notice here is I'm bouncing between a few different NIST special publications. We're going between 800-39, 800-37, and 800-53. So right now we're starting at 839, and the point of the slide is there are tiers of risk management. Essentially, you utilize it for traceability and transparency of those risk-based decisions that start at the tier 1, the organization level, that's your top level, and what decisions are made and policies instantiated by that level drive decisions at the tier 2, which is your business and or business mission processes, and tier 3, which would be the implementation of your information systems and your logical security protections that you put into play. So essentially the risk management process is a tool that evaluates that security risk across all tiers of that system and actually enables that communication that goes both up and down. So that inner tier and intra-tier communications. It also provides a feedback loop for that continuous improvement. And we'll see that through our next slide, or through the flow diagram in a bit. So for a risk management process, there are 4 primary components for that. So key factors for that successful risk management is a process that is well-defined and the key point, repeatable, enabling effective communications. You're not making these decisions for risk management one at a time. This is a process that you start and then you keep reassessing, reevaluating. But here we see 3 processes and 1 core value here with the framing. Within framing, we establish the risk context to produce a risk management strategy that addresses how an organization intends to assess, respond, and monitor risk. So applying this to security, we are defining what are the risk assumptions the organization will take for security, what are the constraints we will take for security risk, and that includes things such as budget, employment, tools, and lastly, what is our risk tolerance for the security of the situation? And an output of this will result in priorities and trade-offs that are handed down to the lower tiers for their evaluation of their tactical strategies. So our first process here is assessing. So during our assessment process, or the assessment process, we are determining the security risk and the degree of harm and likelihood of harm occurring. For example, we're identifying the threats to the organization, the vulnerabilities, internal and external to the organization, harm, given the potential for threats exploiting vulnerabilities, and the likelihood that harm will occur. The output of this whole process is our security risk. So during this step, the organization is going to identify tools, techniques, and methodologies used to assess this risk. And I'm going to add one more step in there, document what those methodologies are. Because if we want this to be repeatable, we need a reference point to go back and tell us how to do this. We are going to identify any further risks or assumptions related to those risk assessments, the constraints that may affect the security risk assessments, roles and responsibilities. So that's a big one here, because we want to know who our points of contact are and what they are accountable for at each tier of our organization, and how that security risk information is collected, processed, communicated through the organization. And further, we also determine what is the frequency of our security risk assessments and how threat information is obtained. Okay, so in our next process is we respond. So in the respond bubble, the goal here is to provide consistent organization-wide response to security risk in accordance with our organization risk frame strategy. So examples here, are we developing alternative courses of action to respond to certain identified security risks, evaluating the alternative courses of action with relation to our original courses, determining appropriate action consistent with that high-level organizational risk tolerance and constraints and assumptions that have been identified. So at this point in time, the organization describes the type of risk response for each identified threat. And, just to put these out there, there are types for accepting, avoiding, mitigating, sharing, and transference of that risk. And finally, we have a monitor. So during the monitoring process, we are verifying that the planned risk response measures are implemented and the information security requirements derived from or traced down from that organizational missions and functions are effective over time. So what that means is we need to determine a periodicity for reevaluation and a strategy for how we're going to go back and validate the effectiveness of those security controls that have been implemented to satisfy those requirements. And I can't see chat, so if I see there's a couple bubbles. Okay, sorry, I was just checking to see if there were any questions in there. So
Not yet. We're watching.
awesome.
We'll help you out.
Awesome. I appreciate that. So really and I'm going to kind of flip back and forth here. Here we've got the tiers of risk management, where we've got the top level tier of our organization, the mid-level, more strategic management tier, which is the business and mission processes, and our more tactical approach of that third tier for the logical implementation of information systems or protections. And mapping that over this process, really the framing of our risk management strategy and process has to start at our tier 1, and that they own that framing and they own that initial assessment, and then what their output feeds as input to each tier below as we decompose the strategy. Does that make sense? Take silence as, yeah, we are good.
Yeah, and we're all good. Keep going. Awesome stuff, Lori.
All right, so now we're jumping into where my previous lives have lived, which is this 6-step risk management framework process that is defined in NIST 800-39. So generally for the customers that I worked with, the driving factor here is the data owner or the system owner has to categorize a system to determine the security requirements, what security requirements are applicable. So what that means, and we're starting here with this categorize button here. And I can get into more detail of that, but we are determining impact level if there is a compromise across the 3 tiers of information security, being confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, but again, we start with this process initiation, which is the prepare, which similar to the previous flow diagram that we looked at. Within this step, we prepare to execute the RMF process from the organization perspective and a system level perspective by establishing the context and priorities for managing the security and privacy risk. So what that means is by defining what the system is, where it's operating, and getting an understanding of not just the requirements coming from our applicable security framework, which, in this case, we're talking 800-53, but you can apply this across the board to PCI, HIPAA. I know my brain just went blank with other frameworks to cite, but we have another driving for security controls or security requirements within our system. And that is defined by the context in which we operate, so our operational environment, and the concepts of how we operate. So what is the data flowing through our system, and what do we need to do to protect that data? So a good exercise there is actually a very simplistic or a very straightforward data flow analysis and threat modeling exercise to determine what those contextual and conceptual requirements need to be. So after we complete that prepare function, then we move to our categorize, which during this time we categorize the system in information processed, stored, and transmitted, because depending on which function we're applying to the information in our system, whether it's being processed, stored, or transmitted, that drives different needs for protecting the information in the system. And we do this based on the analysis of the impact of loss. So impact here, I mentioned it earlier, is impact across our confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So at each point in our system where we are applying one of these functions of processed, stored, and transmitted, what is the impact of the system operations if that event occurs? So after we get an idea of what our system is categorized as, then we move to the select. And this is where we select the initial set of controls for system and tailor those controls as needed to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level of residual risk. And that assessment of that acceptable level of residual risk, guess what? That is driven by the tier 1 organization. So that's where you're going back up that triangle. So you're going down the triangle. If you remember the triangle, we've been moving down that triangle throughout this assessment. Now we're going back up that triangle to communicate, here's what we've identified, and here's our proposed level of risk given these mitigations. So once we get concurrence on that, then we implement those controls and describe how the controls are employed within the system and that environment of operation. Essentially, we need to provide documentation and architecture diagrams, threat models to help document how those controls mitigated each of those risks and to ensure that that is done in an efficient manner. And the assessment of that manner is our next step. So assess the controls to determine if the controls were, 1, implemented correctly, 2, operating as intended, and that often requires user guide documentation to our users to make sure that how they use the system is how it's intended to be used, and to make sure those security controls are producing the desired outcomes with the respect to satisfying the security and privacy requirements as identified in the select process. So we're halfway through our system, and now we're to the point of authorize. So at this point in time, we have selected our controls. We have identified what we need to implement as far as functional implementations or policy-based in order to manage the security risk. And we have assessed how the implementation of each of those requirements has been completed. At this point in time, we take the output of that and we provide it to our authorization official, and they will determine whether the level of risk, residual risk that is left with the system, it meets that expectation or that assumption from our assessment period, and is actually within the levels of approval so that we can actually go forth and continue system operations. And this is a point to consider here where the person who is authorizing our system and actually making the decision to accept that level of residual risk left with the system is generally the data owner. So the person accountable for protecting the information within our system. And then the final process here is our continuous monitoring plan. So we can't just go through these 3 or these 5 boxes and call it complete, because everyday life happens, tactics change, our threat landscape is constantly changing. So we need to determine a plan for continuous monitoring. So whether that is an annual, biannual, once every 3 years, go back and reassess those security controls that have been implemented, and even going back and doing a reevaluation of what the risks are to the system, that is part of the monitor process. So at this point in time, do we have any questions?
Lori, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
In a lot of places, risk management, what somebody thinks is important will vary from department to department or from division to division.
Yep.
And so following that data flow sometimes is difficult because people sometimes only get a view of it and don't understand that they're actually, getting a slice or a few drips out of a gigantic stream of data. How does that risk integration happen in cases like that? I mean, and how long does it take for people to understand that, with those data flow diagrams, which take quite a while to do sometimes, depending on the companies.
So as far as
How difficult is it to do in your experience?
in my experience, it has been a big challenge. And my response to you is I'm very much an introverted person. But as a systems engineer landing on a program where I'm actually butting my way into the software, hardware architects way of how things work in their silos and actually work communicating more across than I do up and down or as much, that is the only way to successfully spread this organization-wide risk awareness. So
yeah, because I think the enforcement is difficult in many of these enterprise architectures and as you say, various architectures, because people don't understand what risk is. And it's not just data risk, there's other kinds of risks. There's financial risk and all kinds of reputational risk and all kinds of other things that are sort of interrelated that create all kinds of grief that people don't anticipate when they lay out their perfect architecture.
And what I can share with you is I've been on programs where I don't have top cover for defining the organizational approach to the risk management, security risk management. And I've been on programs where not only do I have top cover, but I have cover all the way up to my end customer. And we are in lockstep the whole way. Getting that buy-in from tier 1 is priceless. And that will help ease your pain. And it boils down to, with security controls, security requirements, it is so much easier and so far more effective to bake those in at the beginning of your architecture. So going through the entire design process, the system integration, validation, going through that whole process and then adding in your security requirements, you're doubling the cost of your budgeted expenses. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I've been there and I agree.
Yep, same.
But I think it's, sometimes it's difficult for people to grasp the bigger picture.
Yes.
Because they do live in the silos.
Yes.
And, you're making them do something that they may not understand or want to do. And so enforcement, just sometimes you're sitting there going, but who told you to do that?
Yep.
You've
I've
encrypted some data that somebody else actually needs to use down the line, but you didn't tell anybody. Those sorts of things.
Yep. And that's where that cross communication, both up and down and side left to right, is valuable. And I had I had a good point of discussion to share with you, but I forgot what it was. So maybe it'll come back to me.
Laura, there was one more thing, actually. Let me ask you, and maybe you'll cover this later, but you know, one of the observations I've made, and you know, being in the industry for a long time, the exercise of doing the risk management,
Mhm.
a lot of times is a great opportunity. It's like a tabletop exercise. People sit down, then they take a framework, and you go through the implementations mainly because you're trying to do some kind of a compliance. You're going through your compliance obligations for a regulation.
Right, right.
What about operationalizing? You know, it seems like out of all the disciplines that, you know, even in ISC2 we talk about, this is probably the one discipline that has the least, what I've observed in the okay, what happens after you've done your risk assessment? Do you re-evaluate? How does it move from that assessment to an operational model?
And really it boils down to, and this is why 853 is a holistic approach. So it's not only defining the environment that your system's being developed in and how it's being developed, what functions are being integrated with it, but it also breaks into that operational sector that you're talking about. So it's development of a system in a secure sense from inception of your project all the way through operationalizing and even decommissioning. So, and that boils down to, you know, the engineers or your architects that are designing your system, communicating to the end users of your system, not only during that development life cycle, but also telling them, in order to use this system properly, here's what you need to do. And that's what that user documentation that I mentioned earlier, how that comes into play. Does that answer your question?
I would say partially, Lori. You know, I have to be kind of cautious about the fact that, you know, clearly I represent a company that, you know, has a pretty big investment in services. So I can't really speak to my observations directly. But again, I'm just trying to apply an indirect observation that, you know, you apply for maybe a mid-sized organization, you go through this exercise. And then the question is, do I need to tool up to be able to manage ongoing? You know, do I, like, I'm going to do a little bit of Microsoft speak. Do I use like an ADO environment, basically a Azure Online type of tool to track my bugs and changes? And then when something else is discovered, does it get added to that? And as I said, it's like, it seems like sometimes even though I recognize the importance of the life cycle, I wonder if it's if it falls into maybe the same category as when we tell people that they should implement SDL and they go, oh my God, that's so much. I don't know how to do that.
And I hear you. I do honestly hear you. And I think really the root cause that we need to look at may be less of what tools we do use and deciding what tools we use and how we use them, and make that consistent throughout the entire system lifecycle, so that we're not coming in and we have 4 different owners of sub applications within our system, and each one is using ADO, a different way to document their security bugs. Because the risk of management, the person driving this risk management framework process is going to come in and be stuck trying to integrate, okay, engineer A did this, engineer B did that, see another way in D, oh, he did what A did, so that's going to be easy. And I think that is that repeatable and consistent process that we need to make that decision and make sure that we continue to flow and reuse that.
And just because I mentioned ADO, I want to make sure that I throw kudos to other products out there, like ServiceNow does a similar type of tracking, and I believe somebody posted what is that? Exada? I don't know much about the Telios product, but I know there are other products in the market that does so-called tracking. But you know, if you're a mid-sized company, odds are that you need a tool. I mean,
Yep.
I don't think, or you could try to maintain it in Excel, but obviously, you know, you're going to risk the
Yeah.
fact that it's going to get dated really quick.
Yes, it's going to become very difficult to keep that Excel up to date. Whereas using something like ADO, as long as we are applying the same process procedure to that as we go through our different cycles of development, I think that is the key there. And really how it needs to be used is documenting the bugs and actually tying that, providing that traceability back to that security control, so that we have a consistent change log, change management of how impacts and changes to that how that security control is implemented. So I think that would be my key takeaway, would be, you know, having a way to tag what security control that security bug is related to. Does that make sense?
I'm with you. And by the way, a couple of comments that have come in that I just want to share with you. I think actually Joe's the one who raised this is, can you dig into the constraints regarding continuous observation of alert streams versus policy declaration of periodic reviews and log events? And I think that's kind of similar to what I was asking about operational.
Yeah.
There's some other statements, but I'll let you answer that one first.
I think how vital ownership is. I agree there.
That kind of comes into a due diligence, right? Legal due diligence. There have
Yes.
been a few cases recently that have been, how do you measure risk management in a due diligence, watching 1 trillion alerts a day versus the rote policy standards say you do periodic review?
Right. And that is the,
That's attorneys stew, right? They sweat as soon as they hear that.
Mhm. And really it's driving the question of how do you pull the,
What's real? What's realistic?
right, how do you reduce that signal to noise ratio, and what
Right.
is
What's
being generated?
tangible versus intangible due diligence, right?
Mhm. So, and this is where it boils down to, event logging
It-
is different than auditing.
Yes.
And that's the core differentiation there. Okay,
Thank you.
yep, no problem. And at this point, we've gotten through this, our 6-step process for the security risk management framework. At this point, I do have, I mentioned that 800-53 is a holistic approach. So what that means, so security requirement is just the difference between controls and requirements. That's just a little verbiage here. Security requirement is information security and privacy obligations imposed on organizations. So that is your PCI, your HIPAA, your 800-53. Security controls are safeguards or logical and functional implementations with the protection capability to provide the mitigation necessary to meet the objective of that security requirement. So I boiled down to essentially security controls are implemented to satisfy security requirements. So within 800-53, there are well over, last count I had was 853 security requirements spread across 20 families. Now that number may have changed recently because they have added three additional families of supply chain risk management, planning, and program management are all new with the Rev 5 that was released in September of last year of 2020. But really that holistic approach that I was talking about is this notion of trustworthiness and assurance. So what this really drills down to making sure that the system is being developed and you're actually applying assurance or policy-based protections in the environment in which you're operating. So security controls within 800-53 are both functional and assurance. The ones that are assurance in nature fit the bill for that trustworthiness and assurance type of implementation. So the way I think about this, functional requirements are decomposed into logical mechanisms. Encryption, role-based access control. Those are functional implementations to provide actual operational based protections. Assurance are decomposed into organizational policy to establish a trust in how that system is being developed. So if you guys can see the screen here, I just took a snapshot of SI7, one of my favorite security controls in 800-53, and it's talking about software, firmware, and information security. Essentially, you are implementing tools to detect unauthorized changes to the following software, firmware, and information. Whereas assurance really drives down to something you are applying to your operational environment to establish a level of trust. And the example here is change management. So this is really a policy procedure that you have documented in a plan that is followed by your mission, by your organization, and your other tiered levels to ensure that only the changes that happen to your system are documented and authorized, and that impact analysis is performed within the means of your organization. And I also threw these two in here because there are different security controls actually apply to different tiers of your triangle. That if you remember that, an example of an organizational level would be an audit policy. So at that tier, that organizational level, they're going to state, we are going to audit monthly or we'll audit daily, something of that nature. Whereas implementing the audit function, AU2 will define the type, is more of a functional implementation where you are configuring your tools to make sure you are capturing the correct events within your auditing system. So, and I think that's my last slide. Are there any other questions, or do you want me to jump into some of the security controls and the tailoring tools that I've used in the past?
Lori, Jamal had a question for you. Do you want me to read it to you?
Look, you can read it, or I can actually. Why don't you read it?
Okay. He said, thank you for the presentation, Lori. Is it ever the case that the information owner is not familiar with which security controls they should apply to their systems? And he has a follow-up question after that too.
So to answer your question, Jamal, yes and yes. So I've actually, in my role as a systems engineer, where I was taking the I was taking operational concepts and requirements from my customer and going through this risk management framework process. Oftentimes the customer will just say, go follow 800-53, and they won't go any further. So at that point in time, it's a matter of establishing a working relationship as soon as possible, performing my own threat assessment and actually telling them, here's what we feel the impact levels are, and here's our list of applicable controls, and actually getting them to concur to that outcome before we can actually start our work. And oftentimes,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think you probably already touched on this, but I'll read the second part. He said, do you have any experience trying to educate an information owner about the need for security controls during the select phase? And do you have any examples?
So yes, actually we can. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
And I think this is the wrong document I put in here. Well, that's
Yeah,
frustrating.
we can still just see the PowerPoint presentation, Lori, if that's,
Okay,
share something else.
well, that's good because I put in the wrong file within this presentation. So if you recall back to the impact level and across the CIA. So depending on what that impact level is, there's a list of applicable security controls from 800-53 as called out in CNSSI 1253. And that's a government-based document. But going through that and tailoring what controls are applicable out of there and having discrepancies with the customer on that, it is often a time of negotiation and discussion that to determine who is correct with the applicability. And oftentimes they will say, the customer will say it's applicable, at which time, it's generally not. In the past, I've generally implemented what the customer has requested. Does that make sense? Did I lose you guys, or are we still here?
No,
Yes,
no,
it
you got
makes
us,
sense.
you got us.
Awesome.
Hey, here's I know there's still questions coming in, and I think that I should hit on it, but I'm gonna, since I spoke up and nobody else wants to speak up, I will ask you, what's your thoughts about, this is very applicable to companies and organizations that are regulated. Well, what's your thought about, new unregulated, anything unregulated? I know it's always well, you should do it. It's kind of like your car insurance. Why would you not get car insurance? But there's a lot of people out there driving without car insurance. So the reality is that, what's your thought, especially, let's say, for instance, in industrial control companies that run buildings? Like, what's your thought in that?
So the applicability of NIST 800-53 may not be directly applicable to the building and automation systems, but there is a mapping. If you go to the NIST special publication website, there is a mapping for that exact ICS and different operational environments and frameworks. So I strongly feel that the reuse of this risk management framework has value across different industries. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I would totally agree. I mean, there are so many different kinds of industries. There's so many different kinds of regulations in addition to, just your standard auditing ones that all companies, particularly if they're going after insurance or anything of that sort, are going to be forced to show that they've done their due diligence and done this kind of work. And it only helps in the end. It doesn't, it's sometimes takes a while. Sometimes it's a very difficult thing to do. But, once it gets done and you start maintaining it, it reinforces a lot of the good things that come out of the NIST series. NIST has so many different specialty publications right now for different verticals and different, integrating different things that I think there's something out there for everyone that at the core of it also uses the 853 risk management process.
Right.
So let me add a little bit though to that, Jean. It's like you brought up again a regulated space. So it's like, of course it makes sense, insurance, but let's put something in practice here. It's like we have a bunch of CISSPs. Let me ask the question is, our organization has not, we are a not-for-profit. We are a 8-man, 8-person organization. We haven't gone through this process. What's the threshold? Like, I mean, how do you end up in a situation where you're like, yeah, I really need to do this?
Usually you get a customer who asks you if you wanted to be audited. They expect you to have some certain types of controls, whether
Does that mean
they're,
that we
you
are
know,
in-
it's got nothing to do with,
Good call,
with a
Frank.
particular, it has nothing to do with a particular regulatory requirement. It usually has to do with another company saying to you, are you secure? Can you prove it? This is one way of proving it. There are other frameworks out there that you can cross map to this pretty easily right now. I mean,
But
there's all
Gene,
kinds of tools out
what
there.
size?
What size? I think if you start with a small startup, right now the investors are asking you.
But there's
for-
no definitive line, right? You make over
Oh.
5,000, you make over 1 million, you make
True. I'm
you have
I'm
this
one of
many
those
customers.
people-
And
I'm one of
I
those people who
don't-
says you should be doing this anyway as part of training people to become, to write code or to do anything, you know, or do enterprise architecture. I mean, I've done architecture for past 40 years in some shape. or
this is the
form.
hard part about our industry is the dynamicity,
Yes.
whatever.
Yes, new technology, emerging.
Every
markets.
day changes.
Yes. Yes, and it's difficult
well,
to keep up with. Nobody can be
and
What is
everything.
the word? Dynamicity, whatever.
Dynamic.
Especially like, you know, Lori, Jake, you guys like weigh in on
Yes,
this.
Lori, that's
I was going to say is like, here's the, again, I will propose a scenario, a tabletop scenario for you. ISC2 Seattle, we operate on Google. So we utilize Google Drive. We have technically sensitive documents. We have membership information.
Yeah.
And you know what? I mean, would I apply the same rules? I think we do by de facto because we're really smart people. But have we gone through the exercise? And
because
Jake,
we worked for an enterprise before, Frank.
But seriously, it's like take this tabletop exercise. Again, I'll turn this back to Lori because I'd love to hear, like, when would you say, hey, Frank, as an organization, we have to go through this process?
Really, I think that is driven by the request or the requirements of your customers and the data in which you are operating with.
It can also be driven. It can also be driven by bad experiences. If you've paid a ransom, you probably don't want to do it again. If you've paid a BEC invoice, you probably don't want to do that again. And then,
I mean, fraud. And
Yep.
So it's lessons learned. Jake,
It
you're
is.
saying you learn over time lessons learned.
well, look, I mean, ideally, everybody should do it because the FTC has a general requirement of reasonable cybersecurity for basically any business in trade or commerce. But the practical reality is this is expensive. It takes expertise. It's easy for us on this call to imagine how we might do this. But as Frank so eloquently put it, we're all very smart, and this is what we've been doing for a living for between
30 years.
5 and 30 years. And so, but there's a lot of, there's far more companies out there that don't know this stuff. I mean,
But
frankly,
surprisingly, they're becoming much more aware because of all
They
the
are.
publicity around it and all the legal things that are going on. And every day you're hearing something else, either fraud-wise or customers demanding some information from their companies, from their supply chain. How are you being secure? How are you going to stop this from happening to, are you going to be the door that opens into my systems and causes all types of, I mean, if you look at a lot of the nonprofits, one of the reasons why a lot of them are such juicy targets is because, as you say, traditionally, they don't have a background in security. And secondly, they can't afford it. So there are now groups that have come together to start educating people in different areas, in like the nonprofit world, in the different places around the world, are becoming much, much more aware of what's going on their systems, what the internet is, what the computers are. Even if they don't have access to it right away, they know somebody who knows somebody. So, you know, the naivety level has gone from 100% to maybe 65%. This still means there's a lot of people who may want to have this done and don't know how to do it. But these NIST documents and other documents, and there's other frameworks that are similar in different places in the world, talk to people and say, you know, this is available. You might want to get somebody in your company who's interested in it, take a look at it. Do the tabletop exercises is a great idea. I mean, a lot of places, the boards now have to report on, you know, to an IRS or to somebody else saying that, you know, have you taken some cautions?
So I'm going to answer, like throw out another answer at you, Frank. If you look at risk is the likelihood of compromise times impact of compromise. So we
Right.
have a mathematical equation. And whatever is below that level of acceptable residual risk that is set by that tier 1 organization, they are the ones that need to determine what if they need to go through this procedure and mitigate any of that risk.
Yep.
So, you know, like if we see a realization of an event and the impact is the entire brand name has to be repurposed, or, you know, loss of confidence of our consumers and income, then that needs to be part of that evaluation, and that really needs to be driven by that organization level.
I think Doug puts it well in the chat. He says he works primarily with public sector and typically only sees agencies initiate risk management initiatives when there is a higher level executive order requiring them to do so, usually tied to their funding stream. I mean, that's the reality of the business world, is that it's ultimately liability or lack of funding that's going to force change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the recent shift in the insurance market is pretty critical. It's harder to get cyber insurance now than it was, and that should start to let's say impel folks toward actually taking this stuff seriously before they are stuck with a big bill.
Right. And in line with what Doug, you pointed out, my previous life of a systems engineer, at the end of the development of the system, if that 4-star general at the Pentagon did not approve that level of risk associated with the operational security of the program, we didn't get to plug in our system. So that was the driving factor. That's what drove that compliance and the implementation of this process. So very often it is driven by funding or just the right to exist. Are there any questions?
I don't want to toot the ISC Squared Seattle chapter board members' horn, but this, what would I call it? This meeting has been very informative. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Definitely. I think it's
Interesting.
risk is applicable to many different fields, many different organizations, and it's great to talk about it because it's definitely hard to capture it, identify it, and communicate about it. So Great
Yeah,
job. Thank you.
I'd like to say, extend, keeping the conversation open. At this point, we'll